Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final panel of the day, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Susan McIntosh, Interim Dean of Social Sciences. We have three faculty panelists from Social Sciences in this session, and our first speaker is Dr. Danielle King. She is an assistant professor of industrial and organizational psychology, and her research centers on the topics of workplace resilience, identity, intersectionality, and authenticity, and employee voice. Specifically, her work seeks to uncover how daily workplace resilience can be fostered and to find ways to help employees experience authenticity and voice at work. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation and published in both book chapters and scientific articles. She received her BA in psychology from Spelman College and her MA and PhD in organizational psychology from Michigan State University. She'll be speaking on the need for psychological change and anti-racism for effective organizations.
Thank you, Susan. As was shared today, I want to talk about this need for psychological change and anti-racism for effective organizations. Black Americans make up just 13% of the US population, but comprise a fourth of police shooting victims. That disparity is exacerbated when you look at unarmed shooting victims, with Black Americans making up a third of those individuals. So statistics like that make us wonder if Juneteenth is a true time to celebrate freedom, or is it also a time to really ask what work is left to be done? I think it is a true time for introspection and authentic action. And this work must be rooted in anti-racism. And I think it's critical for us in any of these conversations about progress and change to understand that there is no quick and easy fix for systemic racism. Here at Rice, I'm the principal investigator of the Working Resilience Laboratory. So I do study resilience and how do we persevere and overcome adversity and difficulties. I also study diversity and inclusion and employee voice. And I want to first, as a resilience researcher, assert that now is not the time for additional research and focus on resilience and grit and hardiness. It's no longer the time to ask Black Americans to continue to be resilient and persevere despite adversities, but instead we should be asking, why do we require some groups of individuals to display such resilience at a higher prevalence than we do other groups? And so that's where this need for psychological change begins, in my perspective, a shift in what we focus on, the research questions that we ask, what we teach, whose voices we highlight in our classes, and also the types of service that we engage in. When I talk about psychological change, I think it's critical for organizations to realize that that change is just as important as changes in messaging, mission statements, and policies in place. And by that, I mean improvements toward equity concerning the thoughts, assumptions, and expectations we make of certain groups of people. And a critical first step in any psychological change is learning, so that relatively permanent change and capability and behavior produced only by education, experience, and practice. So we must seek out information about cultures that are not our own. We must go beyond the selective perspectives that are covered in traditional educational spheres, and we must center Black voices and experiences in these discussions. And as I said at the start, I think this psychological change must be rooted in active anti-racism. It is not enough to simply talk about diversity and inclusion. It's not enough to just talk about being kind or being a good person. That anti-racism is much more active. Ibram Kendi, one of the thought leaders in this space, gave a wonderful illustration in saying that the heartbeat of racism is denial, and the sound of that heartbeat is, I'm not racist. And so it's not enough to give lip service to these efforts to be considered anti-racist. We must remember that racist is not a fixed identity or category that you either do or don't belong to. That racism is a descriptive term that describes any belief, statement, or action you are embodying at any one moment. And so we have to get uncomfortable and be comfortable with that in these conversations, in these direct confrontations of discrimination that we observe. And we must acknowledge and correct the mistakes that we have made or we make concerning our beliefs, our comments, our decisions, or practices about Black people. We must also not be comfortable with observed disparities. So if we see higher prison rates or lower education rates, we see an expanding racial wealth gap, we see reduced hiring rates and organizational representation within our companies, the only reason we might be comfortable with that is because we inherently believe that certain groups are inferior in some way. So those disparities make sense. So we should not be comfortable with that if we want to enact anti-racism. This conversation about anti-racism and the effects of racism, I believe, are critical, not only because it is literally life or death we're talking about, but also because the survivors and the people who witness these experiences face racial trauma. We know from research that Black people who watch in the media and see on social media these experiences of murder and violence toward other Black people, because they share an identity with that person, they too experience racial trauma. And that is that psychological injury that can overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. And like I said, that can be experienced firsthand, where you may encounter these traumatic experiences and then face psychological racial trauma. But vicariously, this also affects our community members and our employees. This racial trauma has been shown to lead to poor health outcomes and also psychological outcomes. So increased hypertension and increased depressive symptomology. Yet Black employees are expected to leave their humanity at the door and show up to work as if they're not dealing with real trauma and difficulties that incite fear and horror. So we know that these inequities create real challenges and they diminish organizational effectiveness, not only because a segment of your workforce is unable to cope and manage because they're really dealing with trauma, but also because your clients and the people that you service are paying attention to these things and they're also affected. So organizational responses we've seen in recent times are critical, and people are really paying attention to those. So I think what makes an organization effective has shifted, and it's good that now organizations are being held accountable and people want to see real change. People want to see not only words and messages of support, but people want to see those words align with deeds and actions and decisions and behaviors. It's also critical for an organization to be effective, to retain their customers, clients, and employees, that they create safe workspaces for healing from racial trauma. We know from conservation of resources theory and depletion theories that we as humans, our resources are finite. And so we need places to recover. We need time to recover. And so racial trauma also requires a safe space to recover. And what that could look like is organizational representation, right? So effective organization enacting anti-racism would, have representations of diversity across levels, including leadership of their organization. And this signals to your employees that we do understand that members of your group and your racial identity are capable and can lead and are worthy. It also is critical for workplaces to be a safe space for healing from racial trauma, that there is active anti-racist ideology and a zero tolerance policy for racism. One of the things that I also think is critical to talk about in these conversations is that it is the norm to often talk about highly publicized events and things that we see in the media, and only those life or death cases as if, those are the only sources of racial trauma. But what we know is that there are also these insidious, daily, more subtle, potentially ambiguous experiences that also create racial trauma. And one example of that is microaggressions. So those are those brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or not, that communicate some sense of hostility or, racial slurs and insults to some target group. And these microaggressions are rooted in racism. And what does that look like? So microaggressions, for example, may be people acting like they're scared of you instantly, or people at work feeling like they completely understand, your racial identity and experiences, even though they're not of your racial background. It also looks like assuming, Black identity is a monolith and that everyone is the same within that group in some way. That is a microaggression. It also could be making comments or hinting at the fact that people's accomplishments are due to affirmative action and not their earned capabilities and accomplishments. It also is organizations asking Black people to assimilate to white culture and downplay their racial background. And that links to the next point about suggesting in some way that your racial heritage is dysfunctional or undesirable. And we see this often in the policing of Black hair or African-American vernacular in the workplace. And finally, as I stated, it's about this perception, that I don't need to hire people from a certain group, or I don't promote people from those groups, whether intentional or not. These are examples of microaggressions that create additional trauma for your workforce. In research that I'm currently working on with my collaborators, David Hollingsworth, Elliot Starr, Melinda Nelson, we're looking at racial microaggressions and the effects. And what we know from research is that there are negative effects of racial microaggressions on individuals' self-efficacy. There are negative effects of these somewhat or even unintentional racial microaggressions on people's job satisfaction, their ability to sleep. So not only the duration in which you're able to sleep, but the quality of the sleep that you get to replenish and come back to work engaged. And there are positive effects of racial microaggression on negative affects. So there's more negative emotions. There's a positive effect. So there's more state anger, greater social anxiety. Microaggressions increase traumatic stress symptoms. They increase felt mistrust. They increase somatic symptoms like headaches, increase depression, and they reduce well-being. So this, I think, is critical in this conversation, that we understand that racial trauma exists, and it comes from a number of different sources, both outside and within the workplace. And so we must psychologically address these things and enact anti-racism to not tolerate such things in our workplace. So what do I think organizational effectiveness looks like based on this conversation and based on these things that we know? There are a few things that I think must be present. Number one is the absence of these ascribed hostility perceptions or any other negative characteristic you can think of to Black identity. And that might look like not feeling personally attacked if a Black woman asserts her needs or shares a dissenting perspective in a meeting. It looks like listening to the ideas and suggestions of Black employees without assuming they're incorrect or ill-informed or in need of majority member input. To be effective as an organization, we must also acknowledge and actively address racial trauma. So creating spaces for valuing and reaffirming the unique experiences and voices of Black employees. And in line with number one, it's not assuming that every Black person has the same needs or that their needs are stable across time. So you ask your employees, what do they need? How would they like to be supported? And importantly, it's also understanding that racial trauma is difficult. It is a burden. So you don't then place the sole burden on Black employees to fix organizational problems that result from systemic racism. Finally, I think organizational effectiveness looks like the understanding and enactment of Black Lives Matter, not as just a slogan, but a verb. So demonstrating that Black Lives Matter. And this is not just a diversity and inclusion conversation. This is not just a culture conversation, but it's something that organizations have the opportunity to show and enact at every level, at every department. So looking at the processes of recruitment. So what schools do you go to? Where do you think there's top talent to recruit your people? Who do you choose to hire and promote? Who do you pay the most here? How do you distribute the labor? Who do you think, should be rated highest in terms of performance when you look at output? So I think that Black Lives Matter is something that must be demonstrated at all levels of an organization, because the effects of racial systemic racism affect all of us. And finally, I think it's critical for us to have, as organizations, to be effective, a zero tolerance policy for not only the blatant violence, but also the insidious microaggressions that also exacerbate the effects of observed and vicarious racial trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, for a terrific talk. We have a number of great questions. Here's the first one. We'll get to as many as we can, and the rest can be answered online. Could you share your opinion about the recent overload of solidarity statements from organizations and companies? They are aggressively demanded by stakeholders, yet many seem like empty, empathic messaging.
Yes, really good question and very true. That's a part of why I thought it was really important to talk about the alignment between words and deeds, because words do matter. I think in identifying problems and naming them and stating where you stand on things are important, but it is only a first step. It is an initial, vision point, but that people are also paying attention to, like I said, across your organization. Do you enact these things that you say? Do you actually value Black lives? Do you show that, or are you saying it to appease people in some sense of word service, lip service, and that is perceived as inauthentic?
Yeah, so this is a kind of related question, but it takes it in a different direction. Would you talk about the psychological changes that had to take place for institutions like Quaker Oats, NFL, et cetera, to make changes in their organization's recent decisions related to racial injustice? Do you believe these organizations are serious about eliminating racial injustice, or is it just grounded in self-preservation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question too. And that's why I think learning is the first step. So for organizations like the example you gave of the NFL, to really take some time to learn more about the messages that Kaepernick was trying to convey and talk about and really bring visibility to, before just saying, we're sorry, we mean it, we value Black lives. I think if there's not this paired messaging of learning, and I understand the struggles of, the employees within this place or my customers, if you don't really understand why people are protesting or what this is really about, then no, your words of, yes, I will post a Black image and I'll say Black Lives Matter, it's not genuine and it won't last. So that's why I think starting with psychological change is so important, because with that, if you have a clear understanding of what are the issues, what is the history that led us to this point, then any of these enacted changes would actually last. And I think we've seen some companies kind of flip-flop. We've seen, Black Lives Matter messages, and then we've seen people getting fired for wearing Black Lives Matter apparel at work. And that's one of the things that demonstrate that they don't actually understand the purpose behind the movement or the needs, or even the violence that we see during these protests. We're literally protesting, saying that we don't deserve this violence. And then you're at the protest and there's still violence and people are justifying and talking about looting and all those things. And it's like, you're still missing the point that this is a verb. You have to demonstrate that Black Lives Matter. So I think the statements are good. I think the statements open up a conversation, and it also opens up the possibility to hold people accountable and say, now there should be aligned deeds to match those words.
So as a follow-up, since you mentioned firing, there's a couple of questions that I'll link together. Often we see workplaces responding to outright publicized racist interactions by firing employees, for example, Amy Cooper. And linking to another question, saying, I understand the zero tolerance policy, but wonder whether we can use violations as opportunities to retrain rather than to just fire a perpetrator.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. The Amy Cooper example is definitely aligned with what I talked about, this ascription of violence to Black identity. I do think that zero tolerance means different things for different organizations, and that every instance, there isn't necessarily an umbrella policy that fits every organization or every example of discrimination or every microaggression that happens. I think that sometimes potentially it could be a conversation if there is this microaggression that you experience. If you have the capacity and the energy to, take it on and talk with the person, if you feel safe and like it won't put you at more danger to have a conversation, then absolutely. But also, I do think that organizations have to make clear that that's not okay, and that it won't just be a, come and apologize. And as Amy Cooper went on, the media soon after and said, I'm not racist, that's not enough. So I think there need to be these uncomfortable and deep conversations about why that happened and why that can't happen. And in some cases, it may not be possible to reconcile those experiences. So some cases, maybe firing would be best. But I think every organization and every, encounter and experience has to be handled in a different way.
Thank you. And I'm sorry that we've only had a chance to get to a handful of the now 31 questions that have come in. So we'll have some work to do to answer those online, but thank you so much, Danielle. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so our next speaker, let me just close this out, is Dr. Matthew Hayes, an assistant professor of political science. He holds a doctorate from the University of Illinois. His major areas of research include American politics, racial and ethnic politics, political psychology, and political representation. His current research investigates how citizens evaluate the importance of descriptive, symbolic, and substantive representation. He has published also on redistricting and legislative responsiveness, the role of ethnic identity and skin tone in determining perceptions of ethnic discrimination in Latin America, and how personality shapes political trust. Recent work has appeared in a number of journals, including Political Behavior. And his topic today is A Bill of Rights for Whom? Racial Bias and the Second Amendment.
Thank you, Dean McIntosh. What I want to talk about today is America's legacy of unequal protections for fundamental constitutional civil rights. And to talk about this, just a second. To talk about this, I'm going to focus primarily on the Second Amendment, but I want to start with some context and some history before I give you some of my own research on this topic. So one of the most striking examples I've seen in the recent months have been the differences in response between the anti-lockdown protests and Black Lives Matter protests. On the left hand here, you can see an image from a protest in the Michigan State Capitol. Here, protesters stormed the state capitol to demand an end to Governor Whitmer's stay-at-home order. And despite the heightened emotions, which you can see in this image, as well as the fact that many of these protesters were very, very heavily armed, the police response to these protests was largely muted. The protests were peaceful, though ineffective, and we basically moved on. On the right here, you can see an image from a Black Lives Matter protest in Atlanta, Georgia earlier this month. And what's striking to me is how different both the public and police response has been to these protests. So for example, in the small town of Bethel, Ohio, there was a planned Black Lives Matter rally. In response to this rally, a large group of counter-protesters emerged, many of them armed, and tried to shout down and otherwise disperse the handful of Black Lives Matter protesters. We also saw a very striking difference in police responses. So despite the fact that most of these protests are largely peaceful, we've seen the police responding with violence and with force. We've seen the use of less than lethal projectiles, tear gas canisters, even police vehicles to disrupt and stop these protests. And these are protests of Americans exercising their fundamental First Amendment rights. And for me, this raises a really important question. And that question is, why have we seen such different responses to these two different protests? And the answer I'm going to propose today is a difficult one. The answer I propose, one answer might be that white American support for the Bill of Rights is largely contingent on whose rights are being protected. And if we think about it this way, then we can understand that attempts to suppress Black Lives Matter protests is entirely consistent with this country's legacy of unequal protections for fundamental constitutional rights, especially on issues of race in this country. We need look no further than the civil rights protests of the 1960s. Although police have graduated from using fire hoses to using tear gas canisters, the message is the same. Even though we have the right of the people to peaceably assemble, that right is largely contingent on who those people are. This is not restricted solely to First Amendment free speech rights and protests. We've seen this across a wide range of seemingly fundamental constitutional rights. We've seen this in protests around race and racism, but we've also seen it in attacks and intimidation against Black churches in US history, the excessive use of no-knock raids and other extreme policing actions against the Black community. And what I'm going to talk about most today, restrictions on gun ownership. Fundamental constitutional rights are not protected equally across racial lines in this country. And this isn't simply a matter of ancient history. I want to share with you a little bit of my own personal story. So my grandmother and grandfather, Josephine and Alvin Hayes, were two of the founders of the First Baptist Church in South Sioux City, Nebraska. And it was the only Black church for hundreds of miles. And in their lifetime, the church was burned down by white residents of South Sioux City. My grandfather had to personally help in rebuilding this church. Even after the church had been rebuilt, it was a frequent site of KKK cross burnings. Whenever this would happen, the Black parents would rush their children home and then return to the church to ensure that it wouldn't catch fire and burn down again. And despite the fact that the government did not intervene to protect their rights, my grandparents persevered. And though their house is no longer here, their church, which was just down the street, this building still stands today. But what I want to talk most about today is actually the Second Amendment and unequal protection of Second Amendment rights along racial lines. And if we want to understand modern gun control legislation, we really need to understand the centrality of race to shaping gun control legislation and to shaping Americans' attitudes towards gun control. So I want to step back and provide a little bit of context. The first modern gun control legislation occurred in the 1960s. And the 1960s were a period of tumultuous race riots and race relations. The largest of which was the Watts Rebellion in 1965. At the time, it was the largest race riot in US history. And it came in the backdrop of allegations of widespread police brutality and unfair policing practices against the Los Angeles Police Department. These concerns went unheard. The government did nothing to sort of address them, and in fact, injected more money into the police in response to these concerns. This set Watts up to be a tinderbox, so that on August 11th, 1965, when Marquette Frye was arrested on drunk driving charges, a rumor very quickly spread that he had been brutalized by the police. And being fed up with a lack of protection from the police, African Americans took to the streets and protested and rioted. A week later, there were $40 million in damages and 34 people lay dead, most of whom were killed by police or National Guard. So rather than responding to these people's concerns about not being protected by the government, not being protected from the police, instead we saw widespread and bipartisan opposition to Black residents' concerns. So Barry Goldwater, Republican senator from Arizona, said, choose the way of the Johnson administration and yet the way of mobs in the street. And Senator Robert Byrd, a Democrat from West Virginia, said, if Blacks conduct themselves in an orderly way, they will not have to worry about police brutality. And this statement is particularly jarring today in the aftermath of George Floyd's senseless killing, right? It is with this backdrop that we actually saw the Black Panther Party founded in Oakland, California in 1966. So the Black Panther Party was founded with a stated goal of defending Black citizens from police. It came in the backdrop of strong tensions with police, with an overwhelmingly white police force that was receiving, in fact, greater support from the local government, greater funding. And there were repeated allegations of police brutality that went completely unanswered. Largely in response to these Black Panthers, Representative Don Mulford in California sponsored legislation to ban the carry of loaded weapons in all incorporated areas in the state. This led to the Black Panther Party's protests at the state capitol, where armed Black Panthers occupied the capitol and demanded an end to this legislation. And despite this protest, or perhaps because of it, the state legislature enacted this law. Then Governor Ronald Reagan signed it into law. And it was effectively the first modern gun control legislation in the country. Understanding this law requires that we take seriously the centrality of race in shaping this legislation. And this is entirely consistent with what political scientists have found about the nature of public policy in this country and the nature of Americans' policy attitudes. Many political scientists have found that even ostensibly race-neutral political preferences are actually shaped by people's racial views. We can see this in the domain of crime and punishment, where we find that white Americans' support for punitive criminal policies, including the death penalty, the support for those policies goes up when people perceive criminals to be Black rather than white. Similarly, we can't understand Americans' opposition to welfare without taking seriously the importance of perceptions of Black welfare queens as the recipients of such policy. This is what we in political science refer to as the racialization of public opinion. It's important to keep in mind that these preferences are likely gendered as well as racialized, right? Understanding these stereotypes of this threat of African Americans as dangerous or criminal is linked to views of African American men as dangerous and criminal. And similarly, this is related to protection of white women. Reactions to these stereotypes are often predicated on the protection of whites, and in particular protection of white women from dangerous African American men. And this has been the impetus for numerous lynchings in the country, as well as the burning of Black Wall Street in Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. With this backdrop is where some of my research with my co-authors, David Fortunato, who's a proud Rice PhD alumnus, and Matthew Hebl of the University of California, Merced, this is where our research comes in. In this research, we're interested in a fairly simple question. Does the race and gender of gun owners condition white American support for the Second Amendment? To answer this question, what we did is we conducted a nationally representative survey of 3,000 Americans from January to February of 2016. And as part of this survey, we embedded a fairly simple survey experiment to gauge support for the Second Amendment. For this survey experiment, we relied on a growing body of research that has used names, people's first names, as subtle primes to people's race and or gender. So our survey respondents were randomly assigned to read a question that asked about one of four potential gun owners: Connor, Deshaun, Ebony, or Molly. All of these are names that have been found by research to effectively communicate racial group membership. And so for this question, respondents read either Connor, Deshaun, Ebony, or Molly believes that owning a handgun would help keep him and his family safe. Should Connor be able to purchase a handgun? And then respondents were able to express their support on a simple 5-point scale with higher numbers indicating greater support for that person's ability to own a handgun. Our expectations here are, because of the racialized history of gun control, we expect that white respondents should have the lowest support for Deshaun owning a gun relative to other potential gun owners, in this case, Connor, Ebony, and Molly. But because this is really an intersectional story about race and gender, and because of the sort of race-gendered nature of benevolent sexism, we expect that white Americans should be most supportive of gun ownership when it's a white woman who seeks to own a gun for her and her family's protection. Now, I want to walk you through what we find. So here on the x-axis, you can see the horizontal axis, you can see the level of support for a particular person owning a handgun relative to our baseline condition of Deshaun. Higher numbers indicate that that name elicited stronger support than did Deshaun. On the vertical axis here, you'll see the three different names we tested: Connor, Ebony, and Molly. For these results, I'm just going to show you the results for white Americans, although we had them for all Americans as well. So starting with Connor, what we see is that in line with our expectations, white American support for Second Amendment rights are higher when the recipient of those rights, the person who wants to own a gun, is a white man. But it's not just a racial effect. When we look at a name that signals an African-American woman, in this case, Ebony, we also see stronger support for gun ownership. And indeed, support for Ebony owning a gun is slightly higher than that of Connor. But the picture is clearest when we compare support for Molly owning a handgun. Here, when we're tapping into both race and gender attitudes here, and the race-gendered nature of gun control attitudes, we see white Americans have the strongest support for Second Amendment rights. So what does this research tell us? Well, I think it tells us a few things. So first, we find that support for the Second Amendment is still structured by race. Support for Second Amendment rights is lowest when it is Black men who seek these same constitutional protections. But we also find that support is gendered. When it's white women who seek to own guns, support for Second Amendment rights goes up. And this poses a particularly difficult challenge for our current moment, right? So if we're interested in addressing the racial inequality in the sort of provision of rights, this requires us to take very seriously the fact that these institutions that might impose racial disparities might actually reflect, rather than be over the objections of, white Americans' preferences. What we're seeing has historical context. In the 1960s, as in today, in the research that I've conducted, white Americans tend to be much more supportive of protecting the rights of white Americans over Black Americans. So if we seek to correct, if we seek to dismantle this racial injustice, we need to focus first, obviously, on the institutions that structure racial hierarchy in this country. But doing so is going to require that we take seriously the fact that individuals still maintain racial biases in their willingness to support these same rights for African Americans as opposed to for white Americans. And I'll stop there for Q&A.
So we have some questions about protests that, aspects of protests that were not in fact peaceful that people have seen on the TV. So a couple of related questions. What is the psychological purpose of looting? Having seen on a number of media outlets about looting during the BLM protests, how does this compare to your assertion that most of the protests were peaceful? And yeah, so answer that.
Yeah, so the vast majority of these protests in the country have been peaceful. There have been plenty of instances of rioting and looting. I think the important thing to think about is the response to these protests, both when there is and isn't this rioting, right? So if it were the case that the only time we saw the use of police force was in the context where there was rioting or property damage, that'd be one thing. It'd be fairly easy to defend those on sort of standard law enforcement grounds. But we've seen these types of acts of police violence in Buffalo, where there was not serious rioting or looting. We've seen curfews enacted to prevent these protests from occurring. And we saw no similar sort of curfews in the response to anti-lockdown protests, for example. So in terms of the psychology of looting, this is sort of not entirely my area of expertise, but in general, I think it's probably fair to say that if this is anything like the 1960s, residents of these communities are simply fed up, right? So peaceful protest after peaceful protest has led to absolutely no change, as we saw in the 1960s. If peaceful protest leads to no action, eventually, due to people's sort of the reinforcing nature of that on people's lack of efficacy, people are going to lash out. And I think that's probably where we get sort of the violence and looting from.
Yeah. And so I'm sorry we don't have much more time for questions, but I'll ask you one that you might be able to answer briefly, and that is, if African Americans start buying weapons in large numbers, might we get gun control legislation? Is that what we might conclude from your research?
Yes, I think that would be one conclusion that's not too far afield. If it is anything like the 1960s, the idea that the primary beneficiaries of lax gun control policies would be African Americans might actually shift people's support for permissive gun control laws, for sure.
All right. Well, there's a number of other questions that will await you online for answers. So thank you so much, Matt, for a terrific lecture.
Thank you.
And we will make sure that those slides get edited into the recording before it gets posted next week. I know a number of people are concerned about that. All right. Our final speaker this afternoon is Dr. Mikki Hebl, Professor of Psychology and Management. She holds the Martha and Henry Malcolm Lovett Chair in Psychology. She is an applied psychologist who is interested in the ways in which social psychological phenomena can be applied to industries and organizations. Specifically, her work focuses on workplace discrimination and the barriers that stigmatized individuals, such as women and ethnic and racial minorities, face in social interactions, the hiring process, business settings, and the medical community. In addition, she addresses ways in which both individuals and organizations might remediate such discrimination. She holds a doctorate from Dartmouth College and has more than 100 publications in journal articles, book chapters, and edited books. And her topic is how individuals and organizations can reduce racism.
Hello, Rice community. I played softball in college, and they always put the weakest batter in the 9th position. I'm in the 9th position, and I have gone before one heck of an amazing lineup today. But I am just happy to be in the game, and I'm happy to be tuned in with you today on such an important occasion. I thank our dean, I thank our provost, and I thank our president for organizing this Juneteenth lecture series. And I also thank each one of you for tuning in and for being willing to learn and stretch yourself. I've been studying discrimination for 25 years, and I think after 25 years, I should be at the top of my game. I shouldn't discriminate. I should excel at being anti-racist. But I sit before you as someone who tries to be anti-racist, but sometimes fail. And I invite you during the talk to let your own guard down and consider that you too are perhaps racist at times. We are each a work in progress, and I hope this talk will help you move to a good direction. About 2 weeks ago, I got invited to write an article on racism. And whenever I publish, I always think about my current graduate students. This time was slightly different. I decided to invite 13 of my former Black students from Rice University. 11 of them are now currently holding or almost have their PhDs in psychology. They're in academia at schools ranging from Yale to San Luis Obispo to Indiana University. They're in business schools from Creighton's B School to Berkeley's Haas Business School to Columbia's Business School. They include a director of diversity at Allegheny College and a director of diversity at UT's Health Science Center. I also invited a 2020 grad who's dedicating himself to spoken word and coaching others. And I invited a current student. You might know him as Rice's current impressive Truman Scholar. I invited them because I wanted to lift the voices of young Black scholars, and because, well, they're Rice students, and they've worked with me before, and I'm no dummy. They're way smarter than I am. However, I feel it's important to tell you that I speak with them rather than for them. In our article, we make 5 points which I want to share with you. The first 3 points particularly speak to the context of why we need to reduce racism, And the fourth and fifth points directly address the way in which individuals and organizations can reduce racism. The first point that we would like to make is that many Black people are exhausted. It deepens with each new death at the hands of police brutality. It results in reduced productivity, a decreased ability to cope, decreased feelings of self-worth, a desire to zone out, and a lack of getting restorative sleep at night. And if any of you are feeling those things, you are not alone. Importantly, research shows that racism has real psychological and physiological effects, and my colleague Danielle just spoke about some of those. Racism leads to chronic stress, and this chronic stress is associated with chronic diseases, hypertension, PTSD, depression, and heart disease, just to name a few. What is clear is that Black people are currently in a state of psychological and physiological crisis, during which Jennifer Bratter aptly called this morning a tidal wave of racial reckoning. And people seem to be taking a lot of action, but unfortunately many, particularly white people, don't know exactly how best to respond. Many people have written or expressed feelings about their uncertainty of how to act and about their experiences of cognitive dissonance, which is a psychological discomfort. And some common reactions include responses such as, well, I try to treat everyone equally, or I try to do the right thing, or I'm not racist, but why do I feel this discomfort? And how can I possibly make a difference? At a time where it's important not to be silent, my colleagues tell me that there are actually some dumb things you can say. We should avoid saying, I know just how you feel, because we don't. Things will get better, because they've heard this for decades. There are just some bad apples in the police force, because there are more than just some bad apples. The tree seems to have a disease. Or all lives matter, because that's shifting the narrative away from the disease, which is racism. And unfortunately, these sorts of comments, which may be well-intentioned, can actually add to the exhaustion and stress that Black people experience. A second point my colleagues make is that racism extends beyond police brutality. It exists in other spheres: housing, the labor market, education, healthcare, and the criminal justice system. And it's cumulative. The disadvantage accumulates across generations. It accumulates across a single domain. A poor elementary education often restricts later education. And it accumulates across domains. As Alex Bird aptly showed this morning, housing often influences education. Research shows that within race differences can be even larger than between race differences. In one of the most disheartening studies I've ever read, Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford found that Black men, particularly those who look more versus less stereotypically Black, are more likely to get the death penalty, even after controlling for the severity of the crime. In our own research, we found that highly stereotypically looking people have decreased social networks and receive relative to their less stereotypical. And you see how we control for these with the images, with some of the images you see right here. It's terrible that the color of skin in 2020 affects real academic advisors' decisions about which students they recommend for taking difficult STEM classes, but that's exactly what we found. These academic advisors from all across the country were less likely to recommend the more versus less stereotypical Black women, an example of which you can see here. We found the same pattern for Hispanic men and women. Basically, the more they look white, the better off their opportunities are. It's also important to note that racism isn't just the overt discrimination. Racism involves the subtle behaviors too, the unfriendly stares as you see here, the behind doors gatekeeping that keeps Black people out, and the microaggressions that Danielle King so clearly explained. These more subtle areas of discrimination are the focus of much of my own research. And these are taxing beyond belief. A third point my collaborators also stress is that even with all the racism that is targeted at them, Black people are still blamed for the racism they experience. The American dream and the myth of meritocracy states that if you just work hard enough, you'll succeed. Or if you don't succeed at first, try again. And unfortunately, when Black people don't make it, too often they're judged as not having worked hard enough, not being good enough, or only awaiting handouts. And if Black people upset the status quo, as we so vividly witnessed Colin Kaepernick do over the last 2 years, they're punished. Colin silently took a knee, and he was vilified as anti-American and blacklisted, an appropriate word, from playing in the NFL. As a discrimination researcher, many people ask me, how can they reduce racism? What can they themselves do? And this is the fourth point that my collaborators and I make. Our education and awareness is paramount to reducing racism. These are actions we can adopt at the individual level. Each of us needs to invest in becoming more aware of African American history, not the more whitewashed version of it that we've long been given. We need to read the works and words of Black and diverse scholars and of all the scholars who are working in this space. I've listed some books that were recommended to me. Perhaps you've read some or might be interested. I just finished How to Be an Anti-Racist, and as an academic, we need to engage in what Ibram Kendi refers to as educational suasion. We try to teach and persuade students to be anti-racist. Related to this, education and awareness often give rise to anti-racist behaviors. Research on effectively reducing racism suggests that we first need to become aware of the problem. That is, all of us are biased. We need to own this. We are all sometimes, perhaps unintentionally, engaging in racist behaviors. We need to sit down and sit with the discomfort this causes us. We need to listen to experts and reflect. And then we need to use that discomfort, that cognitive dissonance, to motivate us into acting. We are not off the hook because we know that everyone else has biases. This is harmful thinking. Instead, we need to realize that we can each be part of the solution. We must be motivated to act. And then we need to look at our options for acting and set goals. Empirical research suggests that goal setting that's most effective, and particularly in the sphere of reducing discrimination, are goals that are SMART. They're specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. What else can we do to reduce racism? One study my student, who is now a professor at Cornell, did showed this in her undergraduate thesis. She conducted a field study to see how effective allyship behavior is in condemning or condoning discrimination. She asked people walking by on sidewalks to stop and participate in a research study. Their job would be to give their responses to the acceptability of racism, but they had to give their answers after they heard an ostensible participant, who was actually an actor in our study, either condemn or condone discrimination. Importantly, we found that allyship worked, and we replicated this just 2 years ago. When actors condemned racism, our participants did too. But unfortunately, it also worked the other way. When actors condoned racism, so too did our participants. This finding lasted up to 2 months later. So modeling allyship is critically important in reducing racism. My colleagues and I have compiled a list of other things that we can do to reduce racism. You might look over this list and hone in on one thing that you can choose as your own goal. What are you willing to commit to? Can you find something? As my colleague Larry Perkins likes to say, diversity and being anti-racist is intentional and deliberate. And when he comes to talk to my class, he points to people and he says, sort of like the Lorax by Dr. Seuss, that is up to you. It's up to you, and it's up to me. And when he points to people, what he's saying is the burden is on each one of us. So please try to choose something here or elsewhere and make it your SMART goal. And then make it public. Tell someone else what you're planning to do, because we know that public commitment increases the likelihood of action. The fifth and final point my colleagues articulate is that we need anti-racist policies and accountability, not empty promises and more empty promises. These actions are steps we can take at the organizational level. I'd ask you to consider, as the authors of this recent Harvard Business Review ask, is your company actually fighting racism, or is it just talking about it? It's a good read that I recommend. Certainly, many organizations are publicly acknowledging that Black Lives Matter, but we need to hold these organizations accountable. Where were they 4 years ago, decades ago? Will they be here tomorrow, in 2 years? Is this change real, or is it only for optics? Two of our impressive graduates of our own IO PhD program, Enrica Ruggs and Derek Avery, wrote a piece recently published in MIT's Sloan Management Review, which I recommend. It describes why organizations simply can no longer afford to stay silent on racial injustice, and I hope you'll read it. I call out two organizations in particular, Nike, who stood by Colin Kaepernick. Granted, Nike made millions off of Kaepernick, but the other one is much more near and dear to my heart. And I admit it, I have a mutant ice cream eating gene. Ben & Jerry's is not just interested in optics. They're the real deal. And 4 years ago, we did research on their forward-thinking statements then. I'd invite you to sit down, maybe with ice cream in hand, and spend 30 minutes on the Ben & Jerry's webpage. It's not a one-line pro-BLM statement. It's not one paragraph, but 2 screens and many links and articles they have written which declare their anti-racist intentions and recommend to all of us achievable anti-racist actions. Please visit it and see if you agree with me. People also commonly ask me as an organizational psychologist, what can organizations do to reduce racism? In 2016, I felt compelled to respond to a surge of overt racism and uptick in the discrimination that was present in our socio-political climate. And I agreed to teach professional and executive MBAs in the Jones School about diversity management, or about how to optimize the future of the workplace. And I want to go into just very short detail of some of my take-home messages based on organizational theory and empirical research. Organizations who want to be less racist should begin by conducting an organizational needs analysis. What are the needs of that specific organization? These direct the goals and actions of companies. They should consider what a more anti-racist version of themselves would look like and how their organization would benefit. The needs of one organization are not the needs of another, so it's critical for organizations to identify from the start the outcomes that they most want. Organizations that are serious must also get leadership buy-in if they have any chance of being successful with organizational level change. Leaders should ideally not only buy in, but also be in attendance and participating in diversity initiatives. Diversity is not something that should be relegated to and led by HR. And one of the best local leaders I can point to is President Peter Pisters of MD Anderson, who talks the talk and walks the walk. And I'd invite you to look at the diversity and inclusion initiatives that he's championed and reinforced right here in Houston. Of course, organizations must have representation and mobility throughout the organization. So not promises of we will have this sort of numbers in the future, but numbers now. The demographic makeup of our country shows there's little excuse of organizations not having diversity. The excuses of, well, none of them apply or they're just not interested is bull malarkey. However, Black people and people of color also can't get placed and then stuck in the lowest rungs of an organization or be relocated to diversity and HR positions. There must be movement. Research shows that organizations that are diverse have more transparent processes. They should remove fit as a criteria for hiring. Fit is too often a code word for just like me. And in predominantly white organizations, Black individuals too often lack that fit. And research also shows the power of structured interviews and blinded resumes on hiring more diverse individuals. There's a lot of talk about diversity training, bias training, and ally training. I strongly believe these should be empirically based and mandatory. We would never tell organizations that their safety trainings can be optional. And I believe diversity and bias training is safety training for diverse individuals. Now, clearly, single session trainings are not and should never be seen as a panacea. Finally, organizational leaders should be in constant communication with their diverse workforce. They should participate in employee research groups and ensure that they're getting feedback from and listening to Black employees. In conclusion, I want to say that the discomfort that many of us are feeling is important. It's really important. That is cognitive dissonance, and it's what motivates us to act. And I urge each of you to respond by waging a war on racism. Indeed, Black lives depend on it.
Thank you, Mikki. Wow, a terrific way to end our session this afternoon, and indeed the series today. And we are running over time, so let me just say, I see the questions that people have. They're interested in knowing where the articles are that you recommended. They would like a list of the books that have been recommended, and so we'll try to find a way to sort of include that maybe in the slide set. And for people who are concerned again about seeing the slides, these will be available with the recording, and those will be available on the Rice website and Rice YouTube. Currently planning to have those out by Monday afternoon. So let me just take one question that I feel is, probably shared by quite a large number of our viewers. How about the mute paralysis to which we may be driven for fear of saying the wrong thing?
Yeah. I think that it's good to be thoughtful about what you're saying. I think there's a lot of people and a lot of organizations that say you should say something. And so I think what you want to do is be really thoughtful and learn what are the proper things to say. What are the things that my colleagues need to hear right now? And you don't need to find those from your colleagues. So you don't need to ask, how you doing? Or what should I say? Because that puts more burden on those colleagues. But what you can do is you can read, and you can get that information from reading. And I also believe that if you're earnest, your colleagues will understand that. They know and they've experienced racism, and they can also tell good intent from racism. And so what we don't want to do is put the burden on them, but we certainly don't want to stay silent. And as my research says, the more that you're vocal, the more that other people are vocal.
Great. All right. So you have a number of questions, probably on the order of a couple of dozen, to answer online. And thank you again for your talk. And I want to say that, this brings us really to the end of today's inaugural Juneteenth lecture series. I want to thank President Lebrun and Provost DesRoches for organizing today's event, and a big thank you to all of our wonderful speakers today, and as well as to you all for joining us. And I wish you a happy and contemplative Juneteenth.